The morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet countryside cafe, painting the wooden floors with stripes of warm light. Outside, the gentle rustle of leaves harmonized with the occasional chirp of a bird. It was the kind of place where time slowed down, a haven for locals seeking a brief escape from life's noise. Inside, the cafe buzzed softly with the clink of cups and murmurs of conversation. A middle-aged waitress wiped down a nearby table, her motions practiced and unhurried. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of buttered toast. It was a typical morning in this sleepy corner of the world. By the large window sat Jack Carver, the same spot he claimed every time he came in. His chair creaked faintly as he leaned back, savoring his coffee, a deep, black brew that he never added sugar or cream to. Jack preferred it that way, straightforward and honest, much like the man himself. The other regulars barely paid him any mind. Jack had been coming to the cafe for years, long enough to become part of the scenery. He was like the weathered wooden tables or the faded menu board, always there, familiar, and easy to overlook. His attire didn't help him stand out. Jack's uniform was unchanging: simple jeans, a plain shirt, and his favorite old leather jacket, worn and creased from years of use. If you glanced at him, you might think he was just another retiree enjoying his quiet life. But if you looked closer, really looked, you'd notice something different about him. It wasn't in his clothing or the way he sat. It was in his eyes. Those eyes told a story most people didn't bother to read. They were sharp, piercing even, as if they could see straight through you. Jack didn't stare, he observed. His gaze wasn't intrusive, but it was always present, always watching. Most didn't notice, and those who did simply brushed it off. Who would suspect that the quiet man with the silver hair and calm demeanor was anything but ordinary? He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his words were measured. He wasn't rude, just reserved. The waitstaff liked him well enough. He tipped generously, asked about their families, and always cleaned up after himself. But Jack was a mystery. He came in like clockwork, ordering the same coffee and sitting in the same spot. Nobody knew much about him, and Jack liked it that way. He was polite but distant, friendly but not familiar. He didn't share much about his life, and nobody dared to pry. Still, there were rumors. Small towns thrive on whispers, and Jack's quiet presence gave people something to wonder about. Some said he was a writer, coming here for inspiration. Others claimed he was a widower who found solace in the cafe's peaceful atmosphere. Then there were the more outlandish theories: a former spy hiding from his past, a wealthy man who chose simplicity, or even a hermit with a tragic backstory. Jack never confirmed or denied any of it. He just smiled faintly whenever someone mentioned the stories, as if he found them amusing but not worth addressing. The truth? That was Jack's secret. And he guarded it well. Even the cafe's owner, Margaret, didn't know much about him. She'd tried to strike up conversations over the years, but Jack always steered them back to her or the cafe. He knew about her kids, her husband's fishing hobby, and her struggles keeping the old espresso machine running. But Margaret knew almost nothing about Jack. "Funny guy, that one," she'd said to the waitress once. "Keeps to himself, but there's something about him. Like he's seen too much and carries it all in those eyes of his." The waitress had nodded but didn't push further. People like Jack were rare. They seemed ordinary until you noticed the cracks in the surface, hints of a deeper story waiting to be uncovered. On this particular morning, Jack sat with his usual coffee, his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. Outside, the sun rose higher, bathing the landscape in a soft, golden light. He seemed relaxed, almost lost in thought, but those who knew him or thought they did would have noticed otherwise. Jack was always aware of his surroundings. Every time the door opened, his eyes flicked to it. Not obvious, just a quick glance. He took in the details of whoever entered: their height, their gait, their demeanor. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit. Jack's silver hair and weathered face made it easy to mistake him for an average man enjoying his retirement. But his movements were deliberate, his posture too poised. Even seated, there was a readiness about him, as if he could spring into action at any moment. But why would he need to? This was a quiet cafe in an even quieter town. The kind of place where the most excitement came from the occasional lost tourist or a dispute over parking. Jack didn't look like a man who needed to be ready for anything. Yet, he was. The waitress approached his table with a refill pot. "More coffee, Jack?" she asked, her voice warm. Jack glanced up and nodded. "Thanks, Julie." She poured, and he watched the dark liquid swirl in his cup. "Busy morning?" "Not too bad," she replied. "Same crowd, mostly. Nice to see a few new faces, though." Jack hummed, a non-committal sound. He took a sip and returned his gaze to the window. Julie lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to ask him something. But she decided against it and moved on to the next table. Jack preferred it that way. He sat quietly, his coffee growing colder as his mind wandered. Or so it seemed. In reality, Jack was listening, observing, as he always did. The faint scrape of a chair being pulled out, the low murmur of conversation a few tables over, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside, all of it registered in his mind. To anyone watching, Jack was just another man enjoying a slow morning. But there was something about him, something unspoken yet undeniable. It wasn't his clothes or his demeanor that set him apart. It was the air around him, a subtle but unmistakable sense of control. Jack Carver wasn't just a man who knew how to blend in. He was a man who knew when to stand out. Most people never noticed. But soon, someone would. And they'd regret it. Jack's coffee cooled slowly in his hands as he sat, the rising sun casting shifting shadows across the cafe floor. His fingers tapped the edge of his mug in a rhythm only he seemed to understand. To the casual observer, it might look like absent-minded fidgeting, but for Jack, it was anything but. The world outside the window was alive with its usual rhythm. A pickup truck rumbled by, its engine protesting as it climbed the gentle hill. Across the road, a young woman walked her dog, the leash taut as the eager Labrador sniffed every patch of grass in sight. Jack watched it all, not intently but methodically. He saw patterns, movements, and small, almost invisible details others missed. Julie, the waitress, moved behind the counter, her apron tied loosely around her waist. She was humming softly, the tune half-formed but cheerful. Jack's gaze flicked to her briefly, noting the way her hands worked quickly and confidently. Julie had been at the cafe for years, longer than most. She was efficient, friendly, and had a knack for remembering names and orders. "Another refill, Jack?" she asked again as she passed by, holding the pot of coffee. "No, I'm good," he replied, his voice calm, measured. She smiled and moved on, but Jack caught the faint crease of worry on her brow. She had her own problems, he knew, problems she didn't talk about but carried in the tension of her shoulders and the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. Jack noticed these things because he couldn't help it. He'd spent years training his mind to see what others didn't. And even now, in a quiet town like this, those instincts hadn't faded. The doorbell jingled softly, announcing a new customer. Jack's eyes flicked to the door. A man in a gray suit walked in, his tie slightly loosened and his briefcase worn at the edges. Jack assessed him in seconds, mid-40s, slightly out of shape, probably a traveling salesman or consultant judging by the scuff marks on his shoes and the faint creases in his jacket. The man approached the counter, exchanged pleasantries with Julie, and took a seat near the entrance. Jack's gaze returned to his coffee. He wasn't interested in the man. Not yet, anyway. Another car pulled into the gravel lot outside, this one a bright red sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. A woman stepped out, her movements hurried as she adjusted her purse and smoothed her hair. She glanced at her reflection in the car window, then strode into the cafe with purposeful steps. Jack noted her too early 30s, likely running late for something given her hurried manner and the faintly frazzled look in her eyes. She ordered a latte and sat down near the corner, pulling out her phone almost immediately. The cafe was filling up, a slow trickle of regulars and strangers blending into the morning routine. Jack sat quietly, absorbing it all. He wasn't a people watcher in the traditional sense. He didn't stare or linger. But his mind catalogued every detail, filing them away for reasons even he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't paranoia. At least, that's what Jack told himself. Years ago, he'd lived a different life. A life where noticing the smallest inconsistency could mean the difference between survival and disaster. That life was behind him now, or so he wanted to believe. Retirement, they'd called it. A clean break. A fresh start. But no one ever truly left that world. Not completely. Jack carried it with him, not as a burden but as a constant companion. It was there in the way he scanned every room he entered, the way he memorized exits and calculated distances. It was there in the way he never sat with his back to a door, always choosing a seat where he could see the entire space. The door jingled again, louder this time, as a group of teenagers burst in. Their laughter filled the cafe, breaking the quiet hum of conversation. Jack glanced their way. 3 boys and a girl, all wearing school uniforms, their backpacks slung carelessly over one shoulder. "Just a couple of bagels and 4 coffees," one of them said to Julie, his voice overly confident. The group took a table near the center, their energy spilling over into the room. Jack watched them briefly before turning his attention back to the window. The world outside seemed so simple. A car driving past, a bird taking flight, the steady rhythm of the wind rustling the leaves. But simplicity was often an illusion, a mask hiding complexity beneath. Jack knew this better than most. He took another sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him in the present. He liked this cafe. It was predictable, consistent. The people were friendly, the coffee was decent, and the view from his window seat was always the same. But even in places like this, trouble had a way of finding its way in. It was only a matter of time. Jack glanced at his watch, an old but reliable model he'd worn for years. The second hand ticked steadily, a quiet reminder of the passage of time. Julie walked by again, her tray balanced effortlessly on one hand. She caught Jack's eye and offered him a quick smile. "You doing okay over here?" "Always," Jack replied, his tone neutral but kind. Julie nodded and moved on, her focus already shifting to the next customer. Jack returned his gaze to the window, watching as a black motorcycle pulled into the lot. Its rider dismounted slowly, removing a helmet to reveal a head of short, dark hair. The man looked around briefly before stepping inside. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. This man was different. His movements were deliberate, his posture controlled. He wasn't a local, that much was clear. And he wasn't here for the coffee. The man's gaze swept the room as he entered, pausing briefly on each occupant before moving on. When his eyes met Jack's, there was a flicker of something: recognition, maybe, or curiosity. Jack held his gaze for a moment before looking away, pretending to focus on his coffee. The man walked to the counter, ordered a drink, and took a seat near the back. He didn't pull out a phone or look at a menu. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the table. Jack's instincts prickled, a faint but familiar sensation. He didn't know this man, but he knew the type. Trouble. And trouble had a way of escalating quickly. The peaceful hum of the cafe was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycles pulling into the gravel lot outside. Heads turned, startled, as 4 bikers dismounted. They were a striking group clad in leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias, the kind that hinted at a rough life on the road. Their laughter and boisterous voices filled the air as they stomped through the door, their heavy boots clunking against the wooden floor. The cafe's serene atmosphere shrank under their imposing presence. Conversations faded into uneasy whispers, and even the cheerful music playing softly from the speakers seemed to retreat into the background. Jack Carver didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. The moment the motorcycles arrived, he'd caught their reflection in the window. He knew what was coming before they even walked in. The leader of the group, a tall man with a cruel grin and a thick chain hanging from his belt, scanned the room with a sense of ownership. His sharp, assessing gaze landed on Jack, who was sitting in his usual seat by the window, calm as ever. The man sauntered over, the others trailing behind like shadows. His presence was invasive, loud even in silence. "Hey, old man," the leader said, his voice rough, like gravel scraping against metal. He pointed at Jack's table. "You're in my seat." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Jack. Julie froze behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge tightly. She glanced at Jack, worry etched on her face. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took his time, finishing a long, deliberate sip of his coffee. He placed the mug down gently, the faint clink of ceramic against wood echoing in the hushed cafe. Finally, he looked up at the man towering over him. His expression was unreadable, his tone even and calm. "Didn't see your name on it." A ripple of nervous energy spread through the room. Some patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others avoided looking altogether. The biker's grin faltered for a moment before twisting into a sneer. His buddies chuckled behind him, egging him on. "You think you're funny, Grandpa?" Jack said nothing, his steady gaze fixed on the man. Julie, summoning her courage, stepped forward. "Leave him alone, guys," she said, her voice firm but shaky. "He's not bothering anyone." The leader turned to her, his sneer widening. "Stay out of it, sweetheart," he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. The other bikers laughed, their voices rough and mocking. One of them leaned against the counter, smirking at Julie. She stepped back, her confidence faltering. Jack sighed softly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. He glanced at Julie, offering her a faint nod of reassurance. His calm demeanor was unsettling, as though he were entirely unaffected by the tension swirling around him. The leader of the group slammed a hand down on Jack's table, the sudden motion causing several customers to flinch. "I said, finish your coffee and get out before I make you." Still, Jack didn't move. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze unwavering. His composure wasn't arrogance, it was control. And that control was beginning to fray the nerves of the men standing over him. The leader's hand twitched as he loomed closer, trying to intimidate. "You deaf or just stupid?" he snarled. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the bikers' laughter had quieted, replaced by a tense silence that felt almost oppressive. Julie stepped forward again, desperate to defuse the situation. "Please, just let him be," she pleaded, her voice cracking slightly. The leader shot her a warning glare, but it was Jack who spoke next. "Let her do her job," Jack said, his voice low but firm. His tone carried a weight that cut through the noise, commanding attention without effort. The leader blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then he laughed, a harsh, barking sound that lacked any real humor. "You've got some guts, old man," he said, shaking his head. "But guts won't save you when I'm done with you." Jack tilted his head slightly, as if studying the man. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to pierce right through him. "You've made your point," Jack said calmly. "But you're making a scene. Why don't you sit down, enjoy your coffee, and leave everyone else in peace?" The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances. There was something about Jack's tone, steady, almost disarmingly calm, that unsettled them. It wasn't fear or defiance. It was something else entirely, something they couldn't quite place. But the leader wasn't backing down. He slammed his fist on the table again, harder this time. "You don't tell me what to do," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The sound startled Julie, who flinched visibly. A few other customers shifted in their seats, their discomfort growing. Jack sighed again, his patience wearing thin. He picked up his coffee mug, draining the last of its contents before setting it down with a soft thud. He wiped his hands on a napkin, his movements unhurried. Finally, he looked up at the man, his expression unreadable. "You've got a lot of energy," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. "You should save it for someone who'll give you a fight." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking in slowly. The leader's grin faded completely, replaced by a scowl. His hand moved instinctively to the chain hanging from his belt, his fingers curling around it. Julie gasped softly, her eyes darting to Jack. The other bikers tensed, their hands drifting toward their jackets or belts. But Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on the leader. His voice, calm as ever, carried a subtle warning. "Think carefully about your next move." The room felt like it had frozen in time, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Conversations had ceased entirely, and every eye in the cafe was fixed on the standoff unfolding near the window. Even the teenagers at the central table, who had been noisily chattering moments before, sat wide-eyed, watching the scene with bated breath. The leader of the bikers, his chain dangling menacingly from his fist, smirked at Jack's warning. "You think you can scare me, old man? You're out of your league." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, his calm gaze never wavering. His steady demeanor wasn't just unsettling, it was maddening for the man trying to intimidate him. The bikers fed on fear, on the reactions of those who cowered before them. Jack's lack of response was like a void they didn't know how to fill. The leader's grip on his chain tightened, the metal links clinking faintly. He stepped closer, invading Jack's space, his posture full of barely restrained aggression. "I'm giving you one last chance to walk out of here with your dignity intact," he growled. Still seated, Jack tilted his head slightly, as though evaluating the man's words. He finally broke the silence, his tone calm but firm. "You talk a lot about chances," he said. "But it seems to me you've already used yours up." The leader blinked, momentarily taken aback by Jack's composure. Then his face twisted into a sneer, and he glanced back at his crew. "Can you believe this guy?" he said, laughing harshly. "Thinks he's some kind of hero or something." The other bikers chuckled nervously, though their laughter lacked the confidence of their leader. They'd noticed something their boss hadn't, or maybe refused to acknowledge. Jack's calm wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the indifference of someone who didn't care about the threat in front of him. It was the kind of calm that came from experience, from knowing exactly what to do if the situation turned south. Julie, her voice trembling but brave, spoke up again. "Please," she said, addressing the leader. "Just leave him alone. You've had your fun. No one needs to get hurt." The leader turned on her, his sneer turning mean. "Maybe you should stay quiet, sweetheart. Unless you want to." "Enough." Jack's voice cut through the man's words like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, commanding attention. For a brief moment, even the leader faltered, caught off guard by the unexpected authority in Jack's tone. Jack rose slowly from his seat, the wooden chair scraping softly against the floor. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, and somehow more intimidating than any outburst could have been. He stood tall, his posture relaxed but deliberate, his eyes never leaving the leader's. The bikers took a step back instinctively, their bravado faltering as Jack's presence seemed to expand, filling the space around him. He wasn't just an old man anymore. There was something about him, an air of quiet power that couldn't be ignored. The leader, realizing his crew was wavering, barked at them, "What's wrong with you guys? It's just one old guy. You scared or something?" Jack took a single step forward, closing the distance between them. He was now standing just inches away from the leader, his eyes locked on the man's. The leader stiffened, his bravado suddenly feeling hollow. "Careful," Jack said quietly, his tone even but laced with a warning. "You're starting to push buttons you don't want to push." The leader tried to laugh, but it came out forced. He swung the chain lightly in his hand, trying to regain control of the situation. "What are you gonna do, huh? Teach me a lesson?" Jack's gaze didn't waver. "If it comes to that," he said, "you'll wish you'd just taken my advice and sat down." For a moment, the room was utterly silent. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence in their leader visibly eroding. Even the customers, who had been too frightened to move, seemed to sense that the balance of power in the room had shifted. The leader, desperate to save face, snarled and raised the chain, the metal links glinting in the sunlight streaming through the window. "I'll teach you to keep your mouth shut, old man." The chain swung down, but Jack was faster. His hand shot up with precision, catching the chain mid-swing. The metal clinked sharply as it came to an abrupt halt, Jack's grip unyielding. Gasps filled the room as the leader's face registered a mix of shock and disbelief. Jack twisted his wrist slightly, pulling the chain from the man's grasp with ease. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. The leader stumbled back, his bravado shattered. Jack didn't press forward. He didn't need to. His mere presence was enough to send a clear message. "Walk away," he said, his tone calm but unarguably final. "While you still can." The leader hesitated, his pride warring with the stark realization that he'd miscalculated. He looked to his crew for backup, but they were already backing away, their courage drained. One of them muttered, "Let's just go, man. It's not worth it." The leader's jaw clenched. He looked at Jack, then at the chain on the floor, and finally at the nervous faces of his crew. "This isn't over," he spat, trying to save what little dignity he had left. "It is for today," Jack replied evenly. "Don't come back." With a muttered curse, the leader turned and stormed out of the cafe, his crew following close behind. The roar of their motorcycles soon faded into the distance, leaving the cafe in a stunned silence. Jack bent down, picked up the chain, and placed it on the counter in front of Julie. "You should keep this," he said, his voice soft now. "Might come in handy if they forget the lesson." Julie stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, returning to his seat by the window. He picked up his coffee mug, now empty, and set it down gently. "Another cup, if you don't mind," he said, his tone as calm and unbothered as it had been when the day began. Julie nodded quickly, grabbing the coffee pot with trembling hands. As she poured him a fresh cup, the cafe slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before, and the patrons exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of amazement and respect. Jack sipped his coffee, his gaze returning to the window. The world outside looked the same, cars passing by, birds flitting between trees, but inside, something had shifted. The quiet man in the corner wasn't so unassuming anymore. And as Julie watched him from behind the counter, she couldn't help but wonder just who Jack Carver really was. The laughter of the bikers echoed through the cafe, growing louder and more obnoxious with every passing second. The customers pretended not to notice, their gazes fixed on their coffee cups or the scenery outside the windows, but the unease in the room was impossible to ignore. Jack remained calm, sitting quietly as though nothing unusual was happening. His coffee mug rested in his hand, steady and deliberate. Julie, the waitress, couldn't help but notice that unlike the other customers, Jack wasn't fidgeting or glancing nervously at the bikers. His hand wasn't shaking, and his posture wasn't tense. He was completely at ease. That detail made her pause. Most people would have shown some kind of fear, some reaction to the gang's intimidating presence. But Jack looked like he was waiting for something. The leader of the bikers, emboldened by the lack of immediate resistance, sauntered over to Jack's table once more. This time, he leaned in closer, his sneer almost daring Jack to challenge him. "What's wrong, old man?" he jeered, grabbing the collar of Jack's leather jacket. "Scared stiff?" Still, Jack didn't flinch. He didn't swat the man's hand away or even shift in his chair. Instead, his eyes flicked down briefly, catching a glimpse of the tattoo on the man's forearm, a hastily inked skull, with jagged edges and uneven shading. Jack smirked, the expression faint but unmistakable. "You paid for that," he said, his tone mild, as though genuinely curious. The comment hung in the air for a moment before a few of the braver customers let out nervous chuckles. It wasn't loud laughter, but it was enough to echo in the otherwise tense room. The leader's face darkened, his grip tightening on Jack's collar. His buddies stiffened, their laughter replaced by simmering anger. The leader slammed his free hand on the table, the force making the cups and utensils rattle. "You've got a big mouth for someone who's about to get hurt," he growled, his voice low and threatening. Jack didn't react to the display. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying the man with the same calm gaze. Then, without warning, he stood up slowly. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. But as Jack rose to his full height, the air in the room seemed to shift. He wasn't a towering giant, but his frame was solid, his presence suddenly larger than life. The loose jacket and relaxed posture had hidden his true build, but now it was clear, Jack Carver was no frail retiree. There was a quiet strength about him, a kind of danger that couldn't be measured in muscle or bravado. It was in the way he moved, the way he held himself, the way his sharp eyes locked onto the leader with a focus that was almost surgical. The leader's grip faltered, just for a second, as though some primal instinct in him recognized the threat standing in front of him. One of the other bikers, a shorter man with a scruffy beard, stepped forward, eager to back up his boss. "Hey, you think you're tough, old man," he sneered, his hand inching toward the pocket of his jacket. "How about we show you what tough really looks like?" Jack's gaze flicked to the man briefly, then back to the leader. His expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a readiness that was almost imperceptible but undeniably there. "I'd think carefully about your next move," Jack said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the shorter biker mid-step. The leader, trying to save face, let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, we've got a tough guy here, huh? What are you, some kind of retired cop? Maybe an ex-boxer?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words could have been, and it only seemed to unnerve the gang further. Julie, who had been frozen behind the counter, found her voice again. "Please, just leave him alone," she said, her tone firmer this time. "You don't know who you're messing with." The leader turned to her, his sneer returning. "Oh, and you do? What's he gonna do, huh? Call the cops? Let me tell you something, sweetheart, nobody here's calling anyone." Jack cleared his throat, drawing the leader's attention back to him. "She's right," he said evenly. "You don't know who you're messing with." The leader's sneer faltered again, and for a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You think I'm scared of you," he barked, stepping closer. "I've taken down guys twice your size." Jack's lips twitched, Not quite a smile, but something close. Size isn't everything, he said quietly. The leader opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, Jack moved. It wasn't much, a small step forward, a slight adjustment in his stance, but it was enough to send a ripple of unease through the bikers. There was something about the way Jack carried himself, something that spoke of experience, of a lifetime spent handling situations far more dangerous than this. Julie noticed it too. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was a precision in Jack's movements, a quiet confidence that didn't come from bluffing or bravado. It was the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what to do and exactly how much force to use if the situation called for it. The shorter biker with the scruffy beard muttered something under his breath, his hand still hovering near his pocket. Jack's sharp eyes caught the motion immediately. "Keep your hand where I can see it," Jack said, his voice low but commanding. The shorter man froze, his fingers twitching nervously. The leader noticed the hesitation and barked, "What's wrong with you? He's just one guy." But the leader's words rang hollow, even to his own ears. The dynamic in the room had shifted, and he could feel it. The customers, who had been cowering moments ago, were now watching Jack with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They weren't afraid anymore. Jack, still calm, leaned slightly toward the leader, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got two choices," he said. "You can walk away now, with your pride intact. Or you can push this, and we'll see how far you get." The leader swallowed hard, his bravado cracking under the weight of Jack's unwavering gaze. He glanced at his crew, searching for support, but they were no longer laughing. One of them, a lanky man with a scar running down his cheek, muttered, "Maybe we should just go, man." The leader hesitated, his pride warring with the instinct that told him he was outmatched. Jack took a small step back, giving the man room to retreat. "Smart choice," he said quietly. But something about Jack's calm, collected demeanor only seemed to inflame the leader's ego further. "This isn't over," he snapped, his voice shaking slightly. Jack didn't respond. He simply sat back down, picked up his coffee mug, and took a slow sip. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances before slowly retreating toward the door, their leader muttering curses under his breath. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air moments later as they sped away, leaving the cafe in stunned silence. Julie let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the confrontation began. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Jack didn't look up from his coffee. "Just a guy who likes his peace and quiet," he said. But as Julie returned to the counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jack Carver was much more than that. The tension in the cafe lingered even after the bikers left. Customers whispered amongst themselves, exchanging glances that flicked toward Jack. For most of them, the encounter had been startling, almost surreal. How had this quiet man, someone who seemed so ordinary, managed to stand his ground against a group like that without breaking a sweat? Jack didn't seem to care about the attention. He stirred his coffee lazily, his expression unreadable. Julie approached cautiously, setting a fresh pot of coffee on his table. "On the house," she said softly, her voice a mix of gratitude and awe. Jack looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thanks," he replied simply, pouring himself another cup. Julie hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I've worked here a long time," she said, keeping her voice low. "I've seen a lot of people try to handle those guys. Nobody's ever sent them packing like that." Jack shrugged, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid swirling in his cup. "Sometimes, you just have to know when to stand firm." It was an answer, but not the one she was looking for. There was something about Jack that didn't add up. He didn't have the rough, cocky demeanor of someone looking for a fight, but he also wasn't the kind of man to back down. Julie wasn't the only one wondering. Near the window, An older man in a plaid shirt leaned toward his friend and whispered, "I've seen him around. Keeps to himself. Never thought he had it in him." His friend nodded, glancing at Jack. "He's got that look, though. Like he's been through some things." The murmurs grew, but Jack seemed oblivious. Or maybe he just didn't care. A few miles away, the gang of bikers regrouped at a dingy roadside bar. The leader, whose name was Vince, slammed his helmet onto the counter with a loud clang, his face twisted in rage. "Did you see him? Acting like he's better than us," Vince barked, pacing the length of the room. "An old man, making me look like a fool." The shorter biker, called Rocco, slouched in a chair, nursing a beer. "Look, Vince, maybe we should let it go. The guy didn't even touch us. Maybe he's not worth the trouble." Vince whirled on him, his eyes blazing. "Not worth the trouble? Are you serious? Do you know what people will say? That some retiree with a death wish put us in our place? No way. I'm not letting this slide." The lanky man with the scar, called Mitch, hesitated before speaking. "What if he's more than he looks, though? I mean, the guy didn't back down for a second. Didn't even flinch. That's not normal." Vince scoffed. "He's just a washed-up has-been. Probably used to play soldier years ago and thinks he's still got it. We'll remind him who's in charge around here." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Vince was their leader, but something about Jack had shaken even the most confident among them. Back at the cafe, Jack had finished his coffee and stood to leave. Julie watched him pay his bill and slip on his jacket. "You know," she said as he reached the door, "most people would have just apologized and walked away." Jack paused, his hand on the door handle. "Walking away isn't always the right answer," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Sometimes, it just invites more trouble." Julie wanted to ask more, but Jack was already stepping out into the afternoon sun. She stood there for a moment, watching as he disappeared down the road. It wasn't long before the cafe returned to its usual rhythm. The customers settled back into their routines, and Julie resumed her work. But the questions about Jack lingered. Later that evening, when the cafe was empty and quiet, Julie found herself scrolling through her phone. Something about Jack's demeanor had sparked her curiosity. On a whim, she typed his name into the search bar. At first, there was nothing. Just random profiles and irrelevant results. But then, buried in the list, a headline caught her eye. "Decorated veteran Jack Carver retires after decades of service." Julie's breath caught as she clicked the link. The article was dated nearly a decade ago and featured a grainy photo of a younger Jack in a military uniform, standing at attention. The accompanying text detailed his career: Special Forces, multiple deployments, medals for bravery. Her eyes widened as she read. The man who had calmly faced down a gang of bikers earlier that day wasn't just anyone. He was someone who had spent his life walking into danger and coming out the other side. Julie leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought back to the way Jack had handled himself: calm, deliberate, always in control. It all made sense now. Unaware of Julie's discovery, Jack walked the familiar path back to his modest home on the outskirts of town. The streets were quiet, the evening air cool and still. But Jack wasn't entirely at ease. Years of training had sharpened his instincts, and something about the encounter at the cafe didn't sit right with him. He knew men like Vince arrogant, prideful, and dangerous when their egos were bruised. As he approached his house, Jack's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. Everything seemed normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Inside, he locked the door behind him and set his keys on the counter. His home was simple and unassuming, much like himself. But tucked away in a corner closet, behind a false panel, was a steel safe. Jack opened it with practiced ease, revealing its contents: a small collection of items from his past life documents, a few medals, and a compact handgun. He stared at the items for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he closed the safe, his decision made. If Vince and his gang came looking for trouble, they'd find it. But it wouldn't end the way they expected. Back at the bar, Vince finalized his plan. He wouldn't let Jack humiliate him and walk away unscathed. The gang would pay the old man a visit, show him why no one messed with them. "We'll do it tonight," Vince declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. Rocco hesitated. "You sure about this, Vince? What if he's what?" Vince snapped. "A threat? Don't make me laugh. He's just a lonely old man. We'll scare him, rough him up a little. That'll teach him." Mitch shifted uneasily in his seat but said nothing. The gang was committed now, whether they liked it or not. As the night deepened, the gang mounted their bikes and rode off into the darkness, their headlights cutting through the inky blackness. They didn't know it yet, but they were heading straight into a confrontation that would change everything. Jack's grip on Vince's arm didn't falter. The biker leader squirmed, his earlier bravado replaced with fear. His friends, who moments ago had laughed and cheered at their leader's taunts, stood frozen. None of them dared step forward. "Let him go, old man," one of them shouted, but his voice wavered. The thin thread of their courage was unraveling fast. Jack didn't even glance at the man. His focus remained locked on Vince. "You've been walking around like the world owes you something," Jack said, his voice calm but deadly. "But the truth is, it doesn't. And it sure as hell won't care when you find yourself in over your head." He released Vince abruptly, letting him collapse onto the floor with a grunt. The biker scrambled back, clutching his arm and staring up at Jack with wide, fearful eyes. For the first time, Jack's calm expression shifted into something colder. "You need to learn the difference between tough and stupid. Right now, you're just stupid." As Vince scrambled back to his feet, Jack turned and reached into his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate. From his jacket, he pulled a weathered ID card and tossed it onto the table. The card landed face up. In the dim light, the words "Special Forces, Retired" were clear. Below them, a photo of a younger Jack in uniform stared back, his face as stern as it was now. The silence in the cafe was deafening. One of the younger bikers leaned in to get a better look, his bravado faltering as realization dawned. "Special Forces," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Green Beret," Jack clarified, his tone still calm. "I spent over 20 years in places you couldn't imagine, dealing with people a lot worse than you." He paused, his piercing gaze sweeping over the group. "People who didn't make it out." Vince's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. Jack stepped closer to the group, his towering presence now unmistakably intimidating. "You boys have spent your lives pretending to be tough, riding around, bullying people. But you don't know what real toughness is. You don't know what it's like to face death and walk away." The youngest biker, a wiry kid with tattoos covering his arms, took a shaky step forward. "We didn't mean any harm, man. We didn't know who you were." Jack's cold stare pinned him in place. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you think it's okay to intimidate people. To act like you're above everyone else." He pointed toward the door. "Leave. Now. And don't come back." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Rocco, the one who had been silent most of the time, stepped forward to help Vince up. Vince hesitated, his pride clearly warring with his fear, but Jack didn't give him a choice. "I'm not asking," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than a shout ever could. The bikers backed away, their confidence shattered. Vince muttered something under his breath as they stumbled toward the door, but he didn't dare look Jack in the eye again. As the door swung shut behind the bikers, the cafe erupted in whispers. Jack didn't move. He stood still, his expression unreadable, watching through the window as the motorcycles roared to life and disappeared down the road. Julie approached cautiously, her heart still pounding from the tension. "Are they gone for good?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jack turned to her, his features softening slightly. "They won't be back," he said. "People like that don't usually make the same mistake twice." One of the older customers, a man who had been sitting near the counter, cleared his throat. "That was something else. You really were in the special forces." Jack gave a small nod but didn't elaborate. Julie hesitated, then spoke again. "Why didn't you tell anyone? About your past, I mean." Jack shrugged. "Because it doesn't matter. What I did back then isn't who I am now. I'm just a guy who likes his coffee and his peace and quiet." The cafe slowly returned to normal, though the atmosphere buzzed with quiet awe. Customers who had once ignored Jack now looked at him with a mix of respect and curiosity. But Jack didn't seem to notice. He returned to his table, picked up his coffee, and took a sip as if nothing had happened. Julie watched him from behind the counter, still processing everything she'd seen and learned. She thought about the ID card, the way Jack had moved with such precision, the way he had handled the bikers without ever losing control. She realized that Jack wasn't just a regular customer. He was someone extraordinary, someone who carried the weight of his past with quiet dignity. As she brought him a refill, she smiled. "Thanks for standing up for us," she said. Jack looked up, his eyes softening. "Sometimes, it's just the right thing to do." Across town, Vince and his gang sat in their usual spot at the bar, nursing their bruised egos and muttering among themselves. But something had changed. The encounter with Jack had left a mark, not just on their pride but on their confidence. For the first time in a long time, they felt small. And for men like them, that was a feeling they wouldn't soon forget. Back at the cafe, Jack finished his coffee, left a few bills on the table, and stood to leave. As he walked out into the crisp evening air, he felt a sense of peace. He didn't relish the confrontation, didn't take pride in putting the bikers in their place. But he knew he had done what was necessary. As he disappeared down the quiet road, the patrons of the cafe watched him go, their lives touched by a man who was so much more than he seemed. And though Jack didn't look back, he knew that sometimes, actions spoke louder than words. And tonight, his actions had said everything. As Jack stepped outside, the cool evening air met him like an old friend. The golden hues of the setting sun painted the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched over the cafe's parking lot. The soft rumble of the bikers' engines was now a distant echo, swallowed by the vast countryside. Jack took a deep breath, his calm demeanor unshaken. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he encountered trouble. Men like Vince and his gang were everywhere, feeding on fear and thriving on intimidation. But today, they'd learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. Inside the cafe, the energy lingered. The buzz of quiet conversations filled the room, customers recounting the scene they'd just witnessed. Julie was still behind the counter, refilling cups and nodding absently at questions from regulars who couldn't believe what they'd seen. "Did you see how fast he moved?" one whispered. "Yeah, like he was trained for it," another replied. Jack wasn't far from the cafe when Julie appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hey, Jack," she called, her voice carrying over the stillness of the evening. He paused and turned back, his brow lifting slightly in curiosity. "Wait a sec," she said, jogging over. "I just wanted to say, thank you. What you did back there, it wasn't just brave. It was, well, it made all of us feel safe again." Jack gave her a small smile. "Glad I could help," he said simply. Julie hesitated, fiddling with the edge of her apron. "You didn't have to do it, though." Most people wouldn't. Why did you? Jack tilted his head, considering the question. Because someone has to. Bullies like them get away with too much because people are afraid to stand up. And when you give people like that power, it only makes them worse. Julie nodded slowly, his words sinking in. Well, we're lucky you were here. Really lucky. He chuckled softly. Or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. No way, she said firmly, shaking her head. Definitely lucky. The encounter had left more than just an impression on the cafe's customers. By the next morning, word had spread around town. Jack's name, once just a casual mention among regulars, now carried an air of mystery and admiration. People who had seen him around began to wonder who he really was. The quiet man who sipped his coffee by the window had suddenly become a figure of intrigue. At the local grocery store, two elderly women whispered near the produce aisle. "Did you hear about what happened at the cafe?" one asked. "Oh, yes. That Jack fellow, wasn't it? Took on a whole gang. And he didn't even break a sweat." Meanwhile, at the auto shop, the story grew legs. The mechanics, known for their love of embellishment, added details that weren't even close to true. "They say he used to be a spy," one said, holding up a wrench for emphasis. "Took out 20 guys in a single mission. Special forces, man," another chimed in. "He probably has a secret bunker full of weapons somewhere." While the town buzzed with admiration, trouble brewed elsewhere. Vince, still nursing his injured pride, was far from letting the matter go. At a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, he sat with his crew, nursing a drink and a bruised ego. "I'm telling you," Vince growled, slamming his glass on the table. "That old guy humiliated me." "Us." Rocco, the most level-headed of the group, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Maybe we should just let it go, Vince. He's not someone to mess with." Vince shot him a glare. "Let it go? Are you kidding me? He made me look weak. If word gets around, no one's gonna respect us." "Word's already around," one of the younger bikers muttered, glancing at his phone. "Everyone's talking about it?" Vince's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they know the full story. We're not backing down." "But he's special forces, man," Rocco said cautiously. "That's not a fight we can win." Vince smirked, a dangerous gleam in his eye. "We don't need to fight fair. We just need to win." Back at the cafe, life had started to return to normal, though the shadow of the previous day's events lingered. Julie couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't over. She caught herself glancing out the window more often, scanning the road for any sign of trouble. Jack, meanwhile, was as steady as ever. He arrived at his usual time, ordered his usual coffee, and sat in his usual spot. But today, he noticed the atmosphere had changed. People approached him, offering quiet thanks or nodding in acknowledgement. Even the cook came out from the kitchen, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "Didn't think I'd see the day those punks got what they deserved," the cook said, grinning. Jack accepted the praise with a small nod but didn't say much. He wasn't one for attention. Julie approached his table with a fresh cup. "You're kind of a celebrity now, you know." Jack sighed. "Not my goal." "Well, people are grateful," she said. "I'm grateful." He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Just doing what needed to be done." Unbeknownst to Jack, Vince and his gang were plotting their next move. Emboldened by anger and desperation, they decided to return to the cafe not for coffee, but for revenge. Vince's plan wasn't just about settling a score. It was about reclaiming the fear and respect he believed Jack had stolen from him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the countryside, the rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance once again. But this time, Jack was ready. As the gang of bikers retreated from the cafe, their heads hung low in defeat, Jack stood tall and unmoved. Vince, the leader of the group, struggled to catch his breath as he wiped a mix of sweat and frustration from his brow. His hands still tingled from the sting of Jack's grip. He muttered something inaudible, but his words carried the weight of a man defeated, not by a physical injury, but by his bruised ego. "We're done here," he growled, his voice low and seething. "Let's go." Without another word, the bikers slunk toward the door, their once loud laughter now replaced with nervous glances. No one dared to challenge Jack, not after what they'd just witnessed. Not after they had seen the power and control that radiated from the man, who had until now seemed nothing more than a quiet, elderly local. The door of the cafe swung open, and the bikers stepped out into the cold evening air, their motorcycles revving to life one by one. As the sounds of their engines grew fainter and fainter, Jack calmly returned to his seat. He picked up his coffee mug and took another slow sip, as if nothing had happened. The cafe was silent for a moment, the tension that had filled the air moments ago slowly dissipating. It was as though the cafe itself was taking a collective breath, exhaling after the storm had passed. Julie, still standing by the counter, couldn't quite shake the sense of disbelief. What had just happened? 1 minute, the cafe was a peaceful haven, the next, it had become the stage for a confrontation that no one could have expected. And yet, in the end, Jack had handled it all with a calmness and precision that made it seem as if this was just another ordinary day for him. She walked up to Jack's table, hesitant but with a deep sense of gratitude in her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Jack glanced up at her, his expression softening just a fraction. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of pride or boastfulness, it was a simple acknowledgement, a recognition that what had happened was just part of who he was, part of the life he had lived. "Just another day," Jack replied in his low, steady voice. Julie stood there for a moment longer, taking in the quiet strength of the man before her. She had seen many things in her life, but never someone so composed in the face of such chaos. There was something about him, something that made her feel safer just by being in his presence. As the minutes passed and the bikers' rumbling engines faded into the distance, the atmosphere inside the cafe slowly returned to normal. The regulars, who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence, began to murmur amongst themselves. The tension in the air that had once gripped the room was now replaced by a quiet admiration for Jack. He was no longer just the quiet old man who drank his coffee alone by the window. He had become something more, a man who had stood up when it mattered most, someone who had shown what true strength looked like. One by one, the customers began to speak up, breaking the silence that had hung so thick moments before. "I didn't think anyone could stand up to them," one customer said, shaking his head in disbelief. "But that guy? He didn't even flinch." "Yeah," another added. "I've never seen anything like that. He just took control of the situation, and those bikers, those tough guys, they just crumbled." Julie smiled to herself, her chest swelling with pride. Jack had done more than just defend himself or the cafe. He had shown everyone in the room that courage didn't come in the form of loud boasts or intimidating postures. Sometimes, courage came in the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of, even if the world didn't. As the day wore on, the cafe returned to its usual rhythm. The chairs clinked, coffee was poured, and soft chatter filled the air. But something had changed. The cafe felt different, as if the people who had witnessed Jack's actions carried with them a new sense of respect for the man who had quietly shared their space for so long. No one would ever see Jack the same way again. Julie, still behind the counter, couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth whenever she glanced in Jack's direction. She had seen so much in her life: troublemakers, the occasional confrontation, but she had never seen someone take control of a situation with such effortless authority. She had known there was more to Jack than met the eye, but now she understood that there was much more beneath the surface than she could have imagined. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting its golden glow over the rolling fields outside, the cafe's regulars came and went, exchanging pleasantries and acknowledging Jack with subtle nods and grateful smiles. The word had spread, and though no one was bold enough to ask Jack about his past, it was clear that they had all seen something in him that changed how they viewed the world around them. Out in the parking lot, the bikers' motorcycles were gone, their roar replaced by the silence of the evening. The tension they had brought to the cafe had evaporated with their departure, leaving behind only a sense of calm and satisfaction. But for Jack, it wasn't about the crowd or the recognition. He hadn't done it for the praise. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. As he stood up from his table and slipped his jacket on, he glanced out the window at the setting sun, the quiet countryside stretching before him. For Jack, this was the life he had chosen, a life of peace, of solitude, and of quiet strength. He didn't seek out trouble, but when it came, he knew exactly how to handle it. He walked toward the door, his boots clicking softly against the floor. Before he stepped out, Julie called out one last time. "Take care, Jack," she said with a soft smile. "And thank you, again." Jack paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. A fleeting look of acknowledgement passed between them, a silent understanding that didn't need words. "Take care of yourself, too," Jack said, his voice steady and kind. And then, with a final glance around the cafe, he stepped out into the evening, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had arrived. As the days passed, Jack's actions became the stuff of local legend. People spoke of the quiet man who had stood up to a gang of bikers without flinching, the man who had kept his cool and taught the bullies a lesson they would never forget. But Jack never sought the attention. He went about his life, returning to the cafe each morning for his coffee and solitude, and each day, he was met with respectful nods from the locals. For Jack, it was just another day. But for the bikers, it was a wake-up call. And for the people of the town, it was a reminder that justice could be served, not with anger or violence, but with quiet strength and unwavering resolve. And so, life went on. The cafe remained a peaceful place, its windows framed by the golden light of the setting sun, and its patrons carrying with them the quiet reminder that sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones you least expect. As Jack stepped out of the cafe and into the cool evening, the door clicked softly behind him. His boots left a quiet echo against the pavement, his figure slowly fading into the shadow of the setting sun. But inside the cafe, the mood had shifted. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. The regulars, once caught up in their own little worlds, now sat a little straighter, with a quiet reverence in their eyes. No one had expected what had just happened. Most of the customers had sat there, sipping their coffee, minding their own business until the bikers had arrived. And even then, when the confrontation had started, no one had imagined it would end like this. But Jack had done something no one had seen coming. He had stood his ground, unshaken by their threats, and in one smooth motion, had turned the tables. He had shown them what real power looked like, not in noise or force, but in calm, unshakable confidence. Now, as the minutes passed, people looked at each other, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others simply nodding. The bikers were gone. The noise had faded. And with it, the realization dawned that sometimes the quietest people in the room held the most power. Julie stood behind the counter, wiping down a mug slowly, her thoughts drifting. She had known Jack for a long time, but only now was she starting to understand him, starting to see the depth beneath his calm exterior. She had always thought of him as just another regular who came in for his coffee, keeping to himself. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't seek attention. But today, she had seen a side of him that no one in the cafe had ever guessed existed. Jack hadn't done anything extraordinary in the traditional sense. He didn't need to shout or wave his hands to get people's attention. He didn't throw punches or raise his voice. Instead, he had simply done what he knew was right, calmly and without hesitation. He had acted, and in that action, he had earned the respect of everyone around him, not through bravado, but through quiet strength and the courage to face what needed to be faced. Julie thought about that as she cleaned the counter, running her rag across the smooth surface, her mind replaying the scene over and over. What had made Jack so different? Why had he been able to face down a gang of tough bikers without breaking a sweat? It wasn't just his past, though there was no doubt it played a part. It was his attitude. His belief that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't have to be loud or flashy to be powerful. He was powerful simply because he understood himself and wasn't afraid to act when the time came. Outside, the evening deepened, and the street lights flickered on one by one. In the cafe, people began talking again, though their conversations were quieter than usual. They were still processing what had just happened. They had witnessed something that made them think about themselves, about the world around them, about how they approached challenges. One man, who had been sitting in the corner reading a newspaper, spoke up. "You know," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful, "I've seen a lot of people get into fights before. Heck, I've even been in a few myself. But that what Jack did was something else. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just knew what to do." His words hung in the air, and the others nodded. "It's true," another person said. "He didn't let those guys get under his skin. He didn't even blink. It's like he knew exactly what was going to happen." As they spoke, Julie listened carefully, and a thought stirred in her mind. It wasn't just Jack's ability to handle the bikers. It was something deeper. Something that wasn't just about fighting back or standing tall when threatened. It was about the quiet confidence that came from understanding who you were and knowing what you were capable of. And suddenly, Julie felt it's something that had been missing in her own life. She had spent so much of her time trying to fit in, trying to please everyone around her, always worried about what others thought. But Jack didn't do that. He didn't live his life based on anyone's opinion but his own. He didn't need approval. He had a quiet strength that made him stand out without ever trying to. As the evening drew on, the conversation in the cafe shifted. The regulars didn't talk much about the bikers anymore, but instead, they shared stories of their own lives, times when they had acted boldly, times when they hadn't. And somehow, the atmosphere in the cafe felt lighter, freer. The sense of tension that had filled the room earlier had dissolved, replaced by a collective realization, there was more to each person than met the eye. Julie took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of the people she had seen almost every day for years. They were different now, more thoughtful, more aware of the power that lived quietly in each one of them. Later that night, as Julie closed the cafe and locked the door, she stepped outside into the crisp air. The streets were quieter now, the sound of her footsteps the only noise. She looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling faintly, and a smile tugged at her lips. In that moment, she felt something shift inside her, a sense of peace, of calm. It was like a weight had been lifted, and she knew that, like Jack, she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. She was enough, just as she was. She thought about the lesson Jack had taught her, and she realized it wasn't just about facing down troublemakers or standing tall when confronted. It was about being true to yourself, about knowing who you were and having the courage to act on it without the need for applause or recognition. Jack had shown her that true strength didn't need to be loud or showy. It didn't need to make a spectacle. It simply needed to be real. Julie took one last look around the quiet street and sighed, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful people were the ones who said the least. The ones who didn't seek attention. The ones who quietly changed the world around them with their actions, not their words. As she turned to head home, she smiled again, thinking of Jack. He may not have asked for respect, but he had earned it in the most powerful way possible, through his actions, his strength, and his quiet resolve. And as the night settled around her, Julie knew that she would never forget the lesson Jack had taught them all. Sometimes, the quietest people have the loudest stories. And every so often, life reminds us, you never know who you're dealing with.